Hello there and welcome to my presentation. I'm really pleased to be kicking off the module and tackling the question, is the war in Ukraine a new or an old war? For purposes of context, I will be dealing with the 2022 invasion of Ukraine and not the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the subsequent war in Donbass. The approaches started off with Kenneth Waltz in his book Man, the State and War, a theoretical analysis. He posed three levels of analysis, starting with the individual, then the state, and then the system, which we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So starting with the individual, it starts with human nature, and they're largely split up in between pessimists and optimists. Ultimately, it is the humans that start war, okay, because human nature will inevitably lead to conflict. So you may view it as Putin, for example, is an aggressive person, and that it was Zelensky's, again, who was a strong individual, who stood to contest the invasion. The picture below, some of you may remember seeing this on the news a couple of years ago when there was a meeting, particularly a couple of days before the conflict started. Putin was asking his advisors, and then one chap in particular, he wasn't giving him the answers he wanted, and ultimately it was Putin that was pressuring him. And there's only going to be one outcome of that conversation, and it was Putin that wanted the conversation to go in his direction. Is there a cure? Well, human nature is immutable, but conditions can change. The conditions which humans act in can change. However, human nature cannot explain everything. For the state, well, if you look at this one then, so really they're looking at analysing the state level. It's the Ukrainian breakaway. So the Ukraine is now a state in its own right, although Russia perhaps contests this view. The other side is that it's the Russian sphere of influence. So the Russians believe Ukraine is in their sphere. However, if NATO is beginning to encroach, then actually NATO isn't a state, although it is made up of states. But the fact is, Russia still believes what is in its sphere of influence is under challenge. Then there's the international system. As we've all covered, particularly for the realists, that's a picture of Kenneth Waltz there. It's the anarchy which leads to the use of force because there's nobody to stop it. It's one of the main features how because there's no governing body, although they can advise, particularly as President Macron tried to prevent war, actually it is the Russian state that went to war. And there's two polarities really involved in the argument. These are known as a key debate in determining war. And the old war is about a distribution of power and whether or not a state rationally produces its own actions. The main systemic debate really in this area we're talking about is the distribution of power debate versus the power transition debate. So starting with the distribution of power, well, really an unbalanced power can make states feel uneasy. So therefore, if Russia believed the balance of power was against them, then that may lead to conflict. Ultimately, from the other side, if Ukraine believe the balance of power is against them, it may lead to them to increase their armed forces, which they did notably since 2014. The other side is the power transition theory, which is most likely when a younger power is beginning to take over. Russia was the established power within the Eastern European region up towards the Crimean area in and around the Black Sea. However, particularly since 2014, with the increase of Ukrainian military power, that then perhaps contributed to Russia wanting to invade because it potentially viewed its power as being superseded by the growing military capability of the Ukrainian state. The article there is an article discussing a wave of military reforms by Ukraine, which you can read if you wish to. Now we're going to look at really the day-to-day level. Okay, what is an old war, and actually, how can we justify the Ukrainian war being an old war? It really starts with the most obvious one is the use of the tanks, particularly from the early days of the invasion. I remember seeing large columns of tanks which were on the road to Kiev, as it was called. The large columns were then countered and perhaps effectively. Moving on, you then see actually it was the Western Allies and the Western powers which were trying to give Ukraine new tanks. It's a really interesting development, particularly if you look, it was only a few years ago there was talk of the tank is dead and that the tank was no more. So if that's the case, then why did the Western powers want to arm Ukraine with tanks to conduct their counter-offensive? Tied to that is the use of mass artillery. Going back, particularly if you look at the front lines around the eastern area, around the Donbass region, there's defined trenches. It very much does look like a World War I style trench warfare. However, the use of artillery has potentially been part of Russian doctrine for a long time. Unlike Western doctrine, where I believe the term is fire to manoeuvre, the Russian doctrine is to just destroy the land with the use of artillery, have a creeping barrage of shells. And I'm sure you're familiar with the scenes of ruined towns in eastern Ukraine. This picture here is to represent the use of uniformed troops. Both sides are using regular units comprising uniformed troops. Whilst traditionally for the new wars they are deemed as professional troops, particularly for this Ukrainian war with mobilisations on both sides, actually this very much points it towards the old war scenario. This picture here is meant to represent Russian imperialism, which was perhaps going back again to the old war style, so we're going back to the imperial period. And this here represents the old war theory of taking territory being a primary factor in the war. And actually it's the gaining of territory which is the objective. Particularly in the early phases of the war, Russia gained a lot of territory in the south of Ukraine, over towards the famous Battle of Mariupol and the siege of the Azovstal steelworks. They took control of a lot of territory. More towards the east, this territory was already possibly disputed from the 2014 intervention. However, there's now been Russian gains around that territory. Particularly if you think around towards the areas Avdiivka, where they're spending a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of resources into taking these towns. And there's just some summarising some short bullet points as to the topics discussed. Now we're going to look at the Ukrainian war from the new wars aspect, and start with a main factor of this conflict has been the use of drones. For example, you can see on the screen a very cheap, mass-produced consumer drone that you can buy on something like Amazon. Has been employed to great effect by both sides, along with other various makes, for example, the Iranian Shahid drones and various others that have been made, not just in the air but also on the sea with the surface drones that have been used to attack the Russian Black Sea Fleet. But the question really comes down to the technology. If you look at the use of drones, then drones, yes, are an aspect of this from a new war angle. However, if you look at technology itself, then actually the argument is to be made that technology is not new, and technology is in fact a proponent of wars for many years. This picture symbolises Ukrainian identity, so it's in order to Ukraine are going to war on the prospect of Ukrainian identity, and correspondingly Russia are going to war because they want Ukraine to have a more Russian identity as opposed to being tied to the West and having the Western values and closer ties with the European Union. Cyber war has really been a main factor of this war. Actually, this cyber conflict does make it very much a new war. This is something we have not seen before. The Russians use the attacks on the Starlink to disrupt Ukrainian infrastructure, and Ukraine's relied heavily on Starlink, which is a private company, to support its communications, both militarily and in terms of a civilian factor. The information warfare has been a domain of the Russian warfare for a long time, and it really has increased exponentially with the Ukrainian wars. They're dictating the information that they want to give out, particularly to the people in Russia. As you can see in the bottom picture is a picture of a Twitter account. This war is the first war really to be used with social media, and it's being employed to a large scale and protracted state-on-state conflict. Now, it's really interesting if you think about it. If you go back only a few decades, if a soldier wanted to contact home, first of all, they would have to write home, which would then take a matter of time. Then with the more modern wars, for example, the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, phone calls were able to be made, which did help slightly faster communication. However, it's only really the 2022 invasion where we can really see information captured and then passed on almost in real time. A soldier, a private on the very, very front line of the war can take a video and send it out, and it can be seen by hundreds of thousands of people within only a few minutes. And the same token, it also helps to bring the front line closer to the home front. Soldiers are able to stay in contact on a much regular basis than perhaps they were before. So it's the home front that is also then supporting the soldiers on the front line. It also depends how you word it. On the eve of the invasion, President Putin called it a special military operation, which would make it very much a new war, as it's a smaller scale conflict. In Russia, they even deny that it is a war and still very much go towards the special military operation angle. As you can see, these are pictures of the Azov Battalion and Wagner with Yevgeny Prigozhin. The Azov Battalion were created after the 2014 invasion, and although they were a paramilitary group in Ukraine, which would perhaps push it more towards the new war aspect, however, they were amalgamated into the Ukrainian forces, which makes them very much now a part of the traditional forces, which perhaps pushes it to an old war. Similar with Wagner. Actually, if you look at it, as they are a private military company, so a private mercenary force, you could say this is an aspect of a new war. However, due to the numbers used and the fact they were wearing a similar uniform, could push it towards the old war. I'm sure there will be many more private military companies still in use, albeit on a much smaller scale. However, not many are publicly known about at this time. There's a short table just summarising some of the key factors that we have discussed. If we consider the New Wars hypotheses, and this is what I pulled out from the Williams and McDonald book, Security Studies. They've looked at a scholar called Mello, and they've drawn up 5 hypotheses. So look at these from the Ukraine angle. They've said the erosion of state monopoly, and that's the combatants and the civilian lines become blurred. If you look at Ukraine to Russia, there still appears to be a distinct delineation between military targets and civilian targets. However, the same can't be said about Russia to Ukraine, notably the massacres at Bucha and other high-profile events that have taken place. They've said economic aspirations, so if that was the main reason for the war, the main reason was to increase the economy. I know, for example, the Crimean economy was under a little bit of stagnation before the war, which some have attributed to a possible factor in the invasion. There's also been a variety of asymmetry. So asymmetry factors involving militaries, politics, and then other methods. They claim it's driven by identity. So if there's identity, that is the Ukrainian identity. Conversely, is Russia trying to establish a Russo-Ukrainian identity and to make them more Russian as opposed to Western. And then there's modern guerrilla warfare, which they've attributed as a threat to Western countries. However, as this is affecting Russia, which is not considered the West, this probably brings this one into question. If you wish to read it in further detail, the reference is on the screen in front of you. So arguments against new wars, mainly 2 main factors. Again, this is drawn from Williams and McDonald. The first one is civilian atrocities. At Bucha, there was a well-publicised massacre which was at the start of the war, and there have been others which have also been mentioned. These massacres appeared to have no strategic objective other than just indiscriminate killing of civilians. They also said there's a globalisation challenge, as whilst globalisation may be a proponent of new wars, however, globalisation has always been as part of human society, with the interconnected nature which sometimes has increased and other times has decreased. So really, what are your conclusions? Well, mine is I believe that Ukraine is very much an old war, although it does show certain aspects of a new war. I've linked on YouTube a video where Mary Kaldor talks about whether or not the Ukraine is a new war or an old war. And for me, one of the main takeaways is that she says it is a conventional war, but that it could develop into a new war. So it's very interesting, particularly if you feel that the war might last for a while longer, that actually it may then take on aspects more of the new war, with more of these smaller operations taking place. So the questions then I just listed on the screen, just to help kickstart the conversations. Does the use of cyber attacks on Ukraine make it a new war? Does the use of drones categorise the Ukraine war as a new war, or is it an evolution of technology? And finally, does the mass use of tanks, artillery and uniformed soldiers make it an old war, or actually can we justify that from a new war concept? So really now it's over to you. So thank you for listening, and if you have not already done so, I encourage you to go and view the essays and the presentations by my colleagues that have also helped contribute to this discussion.